Cathy Devine was a girl with dreams. She was only 14, caught in that in-between stage of childhood and adulthood, where the world feels both thrilling and terrifying. She had a restless spirit, an eagerness to explore life beyond the walls of her home, and a belief, like so many teenagers, that something better was waiting just beyond the horizon. Cathy was born into a loving but struggling family. She had parents who cared for her and wanted to keep her safe, but like many teenagers, she longed for something more. She wanted adventure, freedom, and an escape from the things in her life that felt suffocating. Like so many kids her age, she believed she could handle herself and make her way. Her family, of course, worried, but teenagers don't always listen. On a cool November afternoon in 1973, Cathy made a choice that would change everything. She stood on a street corner in Seattle, stuck out her thumb, and waited for someone to stop. She was running away. A pickup truck pulled over, she got in, and she was never seen alive again. For the first few hours, her parents didn't panic. Maybe she was with a friend, maybe she would call. But then the phone remained silent. And then one of Cathy's friends did something that changed everything. A girl who had been with Cathy that day called Cathy's mother and told her the truth. Cathy had accepted a ride from a stranger, a man in a pickup truck. That was all she knew. Bill Devine, Cathy's father, immediately went to the police. He called friends, searched everywhere, and reached out to anyone who might have seen her, but the leads were few, and none of them brought his daughter home. Days passed with no word. By Sunday night, Bill Devine knew something was wrong. Not a call, not a message, nothing. She would have called, he said. She would have called by now. And in his heart, he began to fear the worst. On December 6th, more than 2 weeks after Cathy disappeared, a woman named Barbara Salling was walking through the woods in Thurston County, picking up trash left behind by campers. It was something she did often, cleaning up after people who didn't respect the land. She was used to finding all sorts of discarded junk beer cans, old clothes, and broken glass. Then she saw something ahead of her, a shape lying in a small depression in the earth. At first, she thought it was a mannequin, but as she got closer, she realized the truth. It was a body. She turned and ran, breathlessly, back toward the road, and soon the police were there, combing through the scene. What they found was horrific. A young girl, face down in the dirt, her face was badly decomposed, her clothing cut in a way that suggested violence. Her pants and underwear had been slashed open. Her jacket pockets had been cut out as if someone had tried to remove any identifying details. There was no doubt this girl had been murdered. Now they just had to figure out who she was. The girl was taken to the medical examiner's office. Investigators knew that identifying her was the first step in solving the mystery. But there was a problem. Her face was too badly eroded by the elements to get a clear look at her, and in 1973, forensic science wasn't what it is today. Still, they had some clues. She was wearing a jacket, she had a bracelet, and she had a distinctive patch on her clothing, a dragon, one that had been sewn on by hand, taken from another item. So they turned to the media, they released a sketch, showed images of the clothing and jewelry on the news, and waited for someone to come forward. Someone did. Cathy's sister, Sherry, was watching when the segment aired. The moment she saw that patch, she knew. "That's Cathy," she told her mother. "You need to call the police." And just like that, the nameless girl in the woods had a name. Cathy Devine. Her family's worst fears had been realized. Now, detectives had a name, but what they didn't have was a suspect. They went back to where Cathy was last seen, the streets of Seattle. They interviewed her friends, trying to get any details about the truck she had gotten into. But the descriptions were vague. A pickup truck. No clear details on the driver. The case was already slipping away. Back in Thurston County, detectives continued their search. They found tire tracks, a footprint, pieces of a bracelet. They even found something potentially valuable, semen collected from Cathy's body. But in 1973, there was no way to analyze it. Without solid leads, the investigation faltered, and before long, Cathy Devine's murder became just another unsolved case. Years passed. And then, in the early 2000s, Detective Paul Barclift was combing through old reports when something caught his eye. A report from the time of Cathy's murder. A truck burning in the middle of the night. The owner? William Cosden, Jr. Cosden was no ordinary man. He was a violent offender, a known thug. And when detectives started digging into his past, what they found was disturbing. In 1967, he had been charged with the rape and murder of a woman in Maryland. He had spent time in an asylum for the criminally insane, and now, here he was, living in the Pacific Northwest. A few tips began coming in, anonymous calls pointing to Cosden. Suddenly, the cold case had heat again. By 2001, DNA analysis had changed the game. Jeremy Sanderson, a forensic scientist in Washington, extracted a DNA profile from the semen found in Cathy's body. At first, there were no matches in the system. Then, detectives decided to compare it to a sample from Cosden. The results were undeniable. A Thyssen-Harmonic locus match. The odds of it belonging to anyone else? 1 in 71 trillion. It was the proof they needed. Cosden had raped Cathy. But would he admit to the murder? When confronted with the evidence, Cosden had only one thing to say: "I haven't killed anyone. It's gotta be a mistake." It wasn't a mistake. Investigators kept digging. They found a witness, a man who had worked at the truck stop owned by Cosden's father. He recalled something chilling. He had seen Cosden wearing bloody clothes the night of the murder. When asked about the blood, Cosden had said he had been poaching deer. Hours later, his truck was set on fire. It was the final piece of the puzzle. On March 8, 2002, nearly 29 years after Cathy Devine was murdered, William Cosden was charged with rape and murder. 4 months later, a jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. Cathy Devine was just a child, a girl who believed she was strong enough to take on the world. A girl who made one mistake, trusting the wrong person. Her case reminds us that violence against women and children is far too common, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, is always worth fighting for. If you or someone you know is in danger, don't wait, call for help, and speak up, because every victim deserves to be heard. Cathy Devine's voice was stolen from her, but her story will never be forgotten. Lacey Larson was the kind of woman who left a lasting impression on everyone she met. Born and raised in Helena, Montana, she grew up surrounded by nature. Her parents, Lois and Harold Reynolds, often spoke of her adventurous spirit and boundless curiosity. As a child, she spent hours exploring the rolling hills, climbing trees, and wading in the cool waters of Prickly Pear Creek. She had a deep appreciation for the outdoors, a passion that carried into her adulthood. Lacey was intelligent, kind, and full of life. She excelled in school and had an eye for photography, often capturing Montana's breathtaking landscapes through her lens. She dreamed of traveling the world, documenting its beauty, but for now, she was content with the simple joys of home. She was loved dearly by her family, who saw her as the bright light in their lives. When Lacey met Dennis Larson, she believed she had found someone who shared her love for adventure. Dennis was charming and charismatic, the kind of man who knew how to make an impression. He spoke of grand outdoor excursions, survival skills, and a life of excitement. To Lacey, he seemed like the perfect partner. They married after a short courtship, and though her mother had some reservations, Lacey was convinced she had made the right choice. But what seemed like a fairy tale marriage would soon turn into a nightmare. On a warm summer afternoon, Lacey and Dennis decided to take a walk along Prickly Pear Creek. The plan was simple: spend a few hours together, enjoy the fresh air, and pick mushrooms along the way. They strolled along the creek's edge, the sunlight filtering through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the water. It was the kind of day Lacey had always loved. An hour later, the mushrooms remained unpicked, and Lizzie was nowhere to be found. The peace of the afternoon was shattered when Dennis Larson came speeding into a gas station, his car screeching to a halt. He bolted out of the vehicle, running frantically toward an off-duty patrolman, Dan Lefbeau, who happened to be waiting for his car to be serviced. "My wife just fell in the creek. She drowned," Dennis cried, his voice laced with panic. Lefbeau wasted no time. He followed Dennis back to the scene, listening carefully as he explained what had happened. According to Dennis, Lizzie had slipped on the wet rocks, lost her balance, and fallen into the rushing waters. The current had been too strong. He had tried to save her, but she was pulled under before he could reach her. Something about his story didn't sit right. Lefbeau took a long look at Dennis, noting his dry clothes. If he had jumped into the creek to save his wife, wouldn't he be wet? He kept his suspicions to himself for the moment and surveyed the area. The creek was indeed swollen from recent spring rains, its current fast and unforgiving. If Lizzie had fallen in, her body would likely have been caught in one of the log jams downstream, but after searching the water, there was no sign of her. Then another detail struck him like a bolt of lightning. There was only one set of footprints leading down to the water, and they belonged to Dennis. Lizzie's footprints were nowhere to be found. By the time backup arrived, Lefbeau had a gut feeling that something was very wrong. But the sheriff's deputies quickly took over, and within a day, they ruled it an accident. The case was closed. For most people, that was the end of the story, but not for Dan Lefbeau. Lefbeau couldn't shake the feeling that Lizzie's disappearance was no accident. Unofficially, and on his own time, he joined forces with Lizzie's parents, determined to find her body. They searched tirelessly, combing the area for any trace of her. Days turned into weeks. The longer they searched, the more convinced Lefbeau became Lizzie had never fallen into the creek. She had been murdered, but without a body, there was no proof. Meanwhile, Dennis Larson moved on. With his wife legally declared dead, he collected on her life insurance policy, a hefty sum that doubled under a special clause for accidental deaths. He took the money and left Montana behind, heading across the country to Maine, where he started a new life. And it wasn't long before he found someone new. Cathy Frost was a vibrant 26-year-old woman with a promising future ahead of her. Independent, hardworking, and full of life, she wasn't the type to rush into relationships. But when she came across a personal ad in the newspaper, something about it caught her attention. The man who had placed the ad described himself as an outdoorsman, someone seeking a lasting connection. His name was Dennis Larson. They began exchanging letters, then phone calls. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Dennis showered her with attention, making her feel cherished and adored. It was a whirlwind romance, and within just 3 weeks, Dennis proposed. Her friends and family were stunned. It seemed so fast, but Cathy was convinced she had found her soulmate. Less than a month after the meeting, they were married. The very next day, Dennis took out a life insurance policy on Cathy, one with a double indemnity clause. If she died in an accident, he would receive nearly $400,000. 3 weeks later, Dennis suggested a trip to Acadia National Park. As they walked along the breathtaking Otter Cliffs, overlooking the vast Atlantic Ocean, Cathy had no idea she was standing at the edge of her fate. That evening, a call came from the National Park Service. A woman had fallen from the cliffs. When park rangers arrived, Dennis was waiting. He claimed they had been hiking together when he heard Cathy scream. By the time he turned around, she was gone. Initially, authorities had no reason to doubt him. It was a tragic accident. But when they called Cathy's mother, Audrey Pomeroy, everything changed. Audrey was devastated, but deep in her heart, she knew something was wrong. Cathy had always been terrified of heights. She would never have willingly gone near the edge of the cliffs. And then there was the life insurance policy, and the rumors about Dennis's first wife. Detective Jeff Harmon of the Maine State Police took over the investigation. As he pieced together the facts, a chilling pattern emerged. 2 wives, both dead in accidents, both with insurance policies that paid out double. When confronted, Dennis's story began to crumble. Under pressure, he admitted they had argued that night. He claimed Cathy had pushed him first. In anger, he pushed her back. She lost her balance, stumbled, and fell. But the medical examiner's report told a different story. Cathy had bruises on her arms, consistent with someone grabbing her and forcing her over the edge. Dennis Larson was arrested and charged with murder. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. After an 8-day trial, the judge sentenced him to 50 years in prison. It wasn't the life sentence Cathy's family had hoped for, but it was justice. 3 months later, Dennis Larson was found dead at the bottom of the Thomaston Prison rock quarry. A clothespin was clamped over his nose and his mouth was wrapped in tape. Scrawled across the tape was a single word: guilty. The official ruling was suicide. To this day, Lizzie Larson's body has never been found. But for her family, for Cathy's family, and for everyone who fought to bring Dennis Larson to justice, one truth remains. He thought he had gotten away with it. But in the end, the past always catches up. Dennis Larson was a man who thought he had mastered the perfect crime. Twice he orchestrated what appeared to be tragic accidents, cashing in on life insurance policies and walking away free. He left behind grieving families, unanswered questions, and a trail of deceit. For years, it seemed as though justice would never come. But the past has a way of catching up. It took persistence, keen detective work, and the unwavering determination of Lizzie and Cathy's families to finally bring the truth to light. Though it took years to piece together the evidence, Larson's pattern of lies finally unraveled, and he was held accountable for at least one of his crimes. While Lizzie's body was never recovered, her family can take solace in knowing her killer met a fitting end. This case serves as a sobering reminder of how easily justice can be delayed, but not denied. It also highlights the importance of questioning narratives, following instincts, and fighting for the truth, even when the system is ready to move on. If you found this case compelling, share this story to spread awareness about the dangers of unchecked manipulation and insurance fraud. Let's ensure victims like Lizzie and Cathy are never forgotten. Collingwood, Ontario, was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's name. A quiet, working-class community where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over fences and children rode their bikes down the tree-lined streets. It wasn't the kind of place where people locked their doors during the day, and it certainly wasn't the kind of place where murder happened. Doreen Morby lived a life filled with love, family, and the comfort of routine. At 34, she was a devoted mother, a wife, and a friend to many. She was the kind of person who always made time for others and brought warmth to every room she entered. Her children were the center of her world, and she spent her days making sure they were happy, cared for, and ready to take on life. She loved baking, filling their small home with the smell of fresh bread and cookies, and she had a laugh that could make even the gloomiest day seem brighter. Helen Ferguson, 38, was much the same. She worked hard, loved deeply, and found joy in life's simple pleasures. She had an independent spirit, balancing her responsibilities with easy grace. She was passionate about gardening, taking great pride in the flowers that bloomed outside her home. Helen had dreams of traveling, of seeing more of the world beyond Ontario. She had plans that would never come to pass. The spring of 1970 should have been like any other. The air was warming, and the town was coming alive again after the long, cold winter. But on one fateful day in April, the quiet of Collingwood was shattered forever. It began with a single door left ajar. When Doreen's husband returned home, he knew something was wrong. The house was too quiet. A sense of unease settled over him as he stepped inside, calling out her name. When there was no answer, his pulse quickened, and then he saw her. Doreen lay on the floor, her body still, her skin pale. There was blood, a lot of it, and there was something else, something even more horrifying. Signs of a struggle, the realization struck like a blow. She had not just been killed. She had been violated and humiliated in her final moments before a .22 caliber bullet tore through her body, ending her life. Panic set in. The authorities arrived quickly, combing through the home, searching for anything that might lead them to the monster who had done this. They found bullet casings, marks of forced entry, and, most importantly, a single piece of biological evidence: the killer's blood. But in 1970, forensic science was still in its infancy. DNA testing was decades away, and all they could determine was the murderer's blood type. A small lead, but not enough. The town grieved. Doreen's family was shattered beyond words. Her children, too young to fully understand, they only knew that their mother was gone and that the world suddenly felt colder without her. But before the town could even begin to process the horror of what had happened, another nightmare unfolded. Just 2 weeks later, it happened again. Helen Ferguson was found murdered in her home. The scene was nearly identical: sexual assault, a .22 caliber bullet, and another life stolen. The police didn't need forensic science to tell them what their gut already knew. This was the same killer. A serial predator was hunting in their town. The fear was suffocating. Women no longer walked alone. Husbands stood guard at night. Doors that had never been locked before were now bolted shut. The police worked tirelessly, following every lead and interviewing every suspect. But the killer had left behind almost nothing. The bullets were traced to the same weapon, but that weapon was nowhere to be found. And without modern technology, the blood evidence was little more than a frustrating reminder of just how close, and yet how far, they were from catching the monster responsible. Weeks passed, then months, then years. The case that had once dominated headlines became a whispered tragedy, a cold case buried under the weight of time. The killer had vanished, and for 25 years, the families of Doreen Morby and Helen Ferguson were left with nothing but grief, unanswered questions, and the hollow ache of justice denied. By 1995, the murders of Doreen and Helen were little more than a ghost story in Collingwood, a cautionary tale that people spoke of in hushed voices. But nearly 600 kilometers away, in the northern reaches of Ontario, a small-town police department was dealing with an entirely different kind of crime: a string of robberies. The spree began in June of that year, a series of break-ins targeting homes and businesses in and around Sault Ste. Marie. Jewelry, cash, and valuables were taken, and the police were desperate to catch the thief. Their big break came when a stolen ring showed up in a pawn shop in Sudbury. The man who had pawned it had provided a valid driver's license: Ronald Glenn West. The name didn't mean much at first, but when detectives ran a background check, the story took a dark turn. Ronald West had once been a Toronto police officer, serving on the force until 1972. But after leaving law enforcement, he had been arrested multiple times for theft, assault, and drug possession. He had a long criminal history, one that suddenly made detectives wonder if there was more to him than just robbery. Surveillance was set up outside his home. A search warrant was obtained. When police entered, they found a stash of stolen jewelry, linking him to multiple armed robberies. West was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But his story didn't end there. Shortly after West was sent to prison, his home was sold, and the new owners began renovations, tearing down old walls and ceilings. That's when they found it: an envelope hidden behind wooden boards in the basement. Inside were 2 gun permits, both registered to Ronald Glenn West. The years on the permits: 1969 and 1970. Detectives who had worked the robbery cases were intrigued, but it wasn't until one officer, Don McNeil, recognized the significance that the connection was made. The weapon registered to West was a .22 caliber pistol, the same type of gun used in the murders of Doreen Morby and Helen Ferguson. With this discovery, the cold case was reopened. The old blood evidence was re-examined, and forensic scientists attempted to match DNA from the crime scene to West's genetic profile. It wasn't a perfect match, DNA testing was still evolving, but it was close enough to secure a warrant for a direct blood sample from West himself. On March 26, 1999, Ronald Glenn West rolled up his sleeve and gave his blood. The results were undeniable. If DNA was found at both crime scenes, probability of another person having the same profile was 1 in 6 billion, an impossibility. West was charged with the murders of Doreen Morby and Helen Ferguson, standing trial nearly 30 years after he had stolen their lives. In court, he showed little emotion. He pleaded guilty, perhaps realizing that there was no escape this time. For the families of the victims, the news was a bittersweet relief. Dale Ferguson, who had been just 8 years old when his mother was murdered, finally had answers, but no answer could bring her back. The grief never faded, but knowing that the man responsible would spend the rest of his life behind bars offered some measure of closure. West was sentenced to life in prison and sent to Kingston Penitentiary, where he would live out his remaining days. A former police officer turned predator, now locked away in the very system he had once served. For the people of Collingwood, for the families of Doreen Morby and Helen Ferguson, justice had taken decades, but at last it had arrived. Ronald Glenn West, once a man entrusted with upholding the law, had spent decades hiding in plain sight. He had moved through life undetected, leaving destruction in his wake. For 25 years he believed he had gotten away with murder, but in the end, justice found him. The sentencing brought a sense of relief to those who had suffered for so long, for Doreen Morby's children, for Helen Ferguson's son, and for the families who had spent decades haunted by unanswered questions. This was a moment of reckoning. West was locked away, never to walk free again, never to hurt another innocent soul. But justice delayed is justice denied. The truth is that Doreen and Helen should have never been taken in the first place. If forensic science had been where it is today, if DNA technology had existed in 1970, would they have had to wait so long? How many lives were ruined in the decades between the crime and the conviction? Cases like this remind us that there are still families waiting for answers. Still, cold cases sitting in evidence rooms, waiting for someone to take a second look. Still, killers walking free. If you know something, no matter how small, about a case that has gone unsolved, speak up. A single piece of information could be the key to unlocking justice. Advances in DNA testing and forensic science mean that more cases can be solved than ever before, but it takes determination, persistence, and, sometimes, the courage of ordinary people to bring the truth to light. Doreen Morby and Helen Ferguson were more than victims. They were mothers, daughters, friends. Their lives were stolen, but their stories will not be forgotten, because justice, no matter how long it takes, is always worth fighting for.